Matthew 5:13-16. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. If you are the light of the world, a town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven.
This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Good morning, everyone. It's good to be with you here today. If you are new or if you have not been with us for the past few weeks, for these couple months, we are going to be talking about the Sermon on the Mount, this huge collection of some of Jesus' most famous teachings in Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. This is some of the most central to Jesus' heart that he gets in his teaching. It stands as the kind of the centerpiece of the Gospel of Matthew, and in some ways it stands as the way to live a Christian life. And I believe that the more we engage, the more that we hear, and the more that we do the words of Jesus, the more we're formed. The more Christ is formed in us, the more the world around us is formed. Will you pray with me now? Father, what we know not, teach us. What we have not, give us. What we are not, make us. For your Son's sake. Amen. Now, when preparing for this sermon on what is now a pretty common image when it comes to Christianity, and just phrases that have entered the common vernacular, salt of the earth, light of the world, I had this very vivid memory of a sermon that I once heard preached on this subject. I actually do think you call it more of a homily. It was the first and only time I had ever attended an Anglican church. And this was in Abilene, Texas. And that day they were very excited because the bishop was visiting from the Dallas area. So it was a very big deal. And the bishop got up to preach on this passage, on the disciples being the salt of the earth, the light of the world. And this man opened his sermon with about 5 minutes of statistics from the National Salt Institute, an organization that I had never heard of, that I thought sound very made up. But wouldn't you know it, according to their LinkedIn page, that's right, not Wikipedia, LinkedIn, the Salt Institute is the world's foremost source of authoritative information about salt and its more than 14,000 known uses. So obviously, they're doing the Lord's work, as salt is my favorite food. Now, obviously, we don't have time to go through all 14,000. I'm just going to do the first 3,000, or I wanted to, at least. But sadly, I don't want to break your hearts too much. The National Salt Institute shut down at the end of March 2019, or as NPR put it in one of the most hilarious headlines I've ever seen, Salt Institute dissolves. So now I just have to wing it without statistics. But you and I both know that salt has many uses, and honestly, you can make a pretty good sermon out of almost any of them if that's the image that you want to go with. Salt, for one thing, I think we often forget this because of how readily available it is to us, but salt is an actual biological necessity for us. We need it to live. Everyone needs salt to live. And especially in desert climates, when the temperatures are very high, when it's harder to remain hydrated, salt is a very hot commodity. They would buy it by the block so that they could just chip little pieces off to eat it. They would let livestock lick it when they needed to. There's a book called Sirach, a Jewish wisdom book that's very similar to the book of Proverbs. And in it, there's a verse that says, "The basic necessities of human life are water and fire and iron and salt and wheat flour and milk and honey." Salt is necessary for life. So maybe, as the salt of the earth, we bring true life into the world, and the world needs us to live. Salt also, and you can fact check me on this one, salt also makes literally everything taste better. Salt chemically enhances the flavor of whatever you add it to. It makes the savory taste better. You can try an unsalted burger sometime and tell me that I'm wrong. It makes the sweet taste better, where all my salted caramel fans out there, oh my goodness. So maybe the salt of the earth metaphor is meant to kind of highlight the goodness of the world. Salt was also used for preservation before there were such things as refrigerators. To keep meat from rotting after it had been cleaned, skinned, you can heavily salt it and dry it. That would make it last for a while. So the salt of the earth is essentially a refrigerator to keep the world from rotting. That's a sermon out there, I suppose. Both the ancient Greeks and the Hebrews used salt in ritual sacrifices. That came as a surprise to me. I didn't remember that. But in Leviticus chapter 2, God instructs his people to offer grain sacrifices with a heavy dose of salt. And in Exodus 30, the incense that was supposed to go in the tabernacle and eventually the temple contained salt. In Numbers chapter 18, salt is also used as a symbol of covenant friendship. So the salt of the earth is purifying, is holy, is a symbol of friendship. Salt was also used to destroy and condemn. Judges 9 tells the story of the murderous king Abimelech destroying the city of Shechem, and once the city was destroyed, he scattered salt all over it. This was done as a sort of curse, both to dedicate the city to a god and also to ensure that nothing was able to grow there, and they weren't able to repopulate into the people who had first offended God. So maybe the salt of the earth is meant to prevent offensive things from growing up, to help completely root out evil. I don't know. I hope you're seeing the pattern here. There's a lot of things that salt can do. There's a lot of metaphors that we can take from Jesus' teaching. As for light, light is pretty much just light. Without electricity, especially, this is another one of those where we have abundant access to it. But if you've ever been out in the middle of nowhere with no street lights, on a cloudy night with no moon and no stars, you've started to feel oppressive darkness. You know that darkness can feel pretty overwhelming pretty quickly, pretty scary, full of horrors and fears of the unknown. But when the sun comes up, when light illuminates what is around you, it brings hope. It brings clarity. It signals safety and security. And I think having this image of light helps us narrow down one piece of the salt metaphor. I think these are meant to be complementary images here. Again, I could be wrong, and you're more than welcome to disagree with me here. If you'd like to, my email is chelsea@sunsetridge. No, I'm just kidding. I could be wrong. Feel free to disagree with me, but think about it. For one, salt and light are meant to contrast. They are meant to stand fully apart. Salt and light emphasize contrasts from what is unsalted, from what is unlit. And let's take this a little bit further. Light brings good to the bad, you could say. In the fear and uncertainty of darkness, light can bring information. It can help you grasp reality. When confronted with a dark room, you see shapes, you see outlines, you kind of stumble and fumble your way through it, and yet you stub your pinky toe and you jam your hip on the corner of the table real hard, and you say words you're not proud of. And when the light comes on, then the room is kind of thrown into relief, and you're able to see the color and the depth. You're able to make out individual items. You're able to navigate the space with confidence. In short, the light in the darkness helps you deal much better with reality. It's bringing something good to the bad. That's why Jesus puzzles over this image. Nobody lights a lamp and puts it under a bowl, an image I will now forever associate with Michael Lockridge, because during the singing of This Little Light of Mine, the way that he reacted at the thought of hiding his light under a bushel, it was offensive to him. The incredulity that you would even suggest it is just outrageous. Now, light is bringing something good to the bad. And then the salt image is a complement here. As a preservative agent, the salt prevents the bad from creeping in, from infecting what is good. It prevents further death and decay and makes what is there palatable and even good, flavorful, nourishing. I think there's something to this about how we are supposed to interact with the rest of the world. And before we go further, there's one more thing that I want to make sure that we all pick up on together. Because I think we tend to mishear these verses when we read them. I think we tend to misremember them when we quote them. Jesus isn't saying, disciples of mine, I need you to become salt. I need you to become light. He's not saying you ought to be salt and light. And he's not saying, I need you to work at this with all your might. Jesus is saying, you are salt. You are light. I'm not giving you something to work towards. I am defining reality. And I don't think it's an accident that this comes right after the Beatitudes, the words of God's blessing. Because when you have the blessing of God spoken over you, when you understand your place as chosen, as loved and accepted in the kingdom of God, your only option is to be changed, to interact with the world differently, and then to go into the world and change it for the better. What's really interesting about this, I think, is that Jesus isn't coming up with this for the first time. We'll talk more about this next week, but Jesus is not teaching a new tradition. He's teaching them what the old tradition really means. He's standing firmly in line with the law of Israel. And here, I think, Jesus is trying to remind his disciples what God always envisioned for his people. Even if we go all the way back to the very beginning, to Abraham, the grandfather of Israel. It was Abraham that God first made his big promise to. And his promise was, I will turn you and your offspring into a great nation, a people so numerous that no one will be able to count them. They'll be like the stars in the night sky. He said, I will bless you. I will bring you to the promised land of Israel. And the one that we are quickest to forget, all people on earth will be blessed through you. Sometimes we talk about God's chosen people as if they are removed from responsibility to the rest of the people on the planet. But that was never the intent. God tells Abraham that he has a plan. That plan is for his blessing to be carried out to the rest of the world. And it is through Abraham, through his children, that will be the case. This continues in the Exodus story. After God delivers the Hebrews from slavery in Egypt, after he parts the Red Sea, after he delivers the people from the Egyptian army, he brings them out to the desert. He brings them to Mount Sinai. And it's here that he tells them that they are his people, and he wants to make a covenant with them. He says, if you are going to be my people, you need to know how to act, how to interact with each other as a community, and especially how to conduct yourself with the rest of the world. Exodus 19, verses 5 and 6 say, now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Again, God is telling them their place in the world, and it's not one of isolation or retreat. God expects his people to carry his love, his goodness, his blessing, his light out to the farthest reaches of this earth. They're meant to be a nation of priests, the one who mediate between God and his people, because every person belongs to God. Every person bears the image of God, and every person is in desperate need to have the blessing of God spoken over them. There's a lot more of these examples in Scripture, but I'm just going to give you one more, I think. Isaiah really picks up this imagery a lot when he prophesies to the people in exile. The opening verses of Isaiah chapter 60 say, arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord rises upon you. Look, darkness covers the earth, and thick darkness is over the people, but the Lord rises upon you and his glory appears over you. Nations will come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. When the glory of God is upon us, what happens? People will be drawn. There will be something different about us. People are going to be curious about us. And people are going to want whatever it is that we have. Here's my point with all this. As God's chosen people, as those who have inherited those promises made to Abraham and to Israel through Jesus, we are the message bearers. We are the ones who reflect God's goodness into the world, and the light that we know stems from the God we worship, falls upon the people who need it. In his book, Stranger God, the psychologist Richard Beck points out that the way we tend to think about good clashing with bad really only works one direction. We have this sense of evil and sin that tells us if we stick too close, if we lean in too much, if we touch, it will infect us. It will suppress whatever goodness that we have. He calls this moral contamination. And he references this study that was done several years ago. I know you remember every newsletter I've ever written. This one was from 19 months ago, so we all remember. But just in case, I'll go through it again. I told this story then. He references this study. Scientists brought people into a room, and they showed them this ratty old sweater. And they told them that this sweater once belonged to Adolf Hitler. And then they invited people to try on the sweater. I just want you to think about how you would respond for a second. Because if you're like me, your immediate reaction is absolutely not. And I have no idea why. And the majority of people agree with me. Most people would not put it on. They wouldn't even touch it. And the ones who did try it on reported feeling uncomfortable and icky because we feel that evil must have contaminated outward. It must be in the very fabric of this sweater that just hung on a man's body. That's what evil does. It spreads, it infects, it contaminates. This also helps us understand a little of what it was like with leprosy. Back in biblical times, there was an uncleanliness that was infectious, that would spread to all people, so they had to self-isolate. The people who didn't have leprosy would keep a very safe distance. But here's what Jesus shows us. That when it comes to the sick, when it comes to the unclean, when it comes to the sinful, when it comes to the evil, Jesus drew near all the same. And the infection actually worked the other way. Jesus' light was not dimmed by any darkness. His healing wasn't negated by any illness, and his goodness was never triumphed over by a power of evil, even the evil of death. Because when it comes to light versus darkness, there is no darkness that can endure God's light. John chapter 1 says that in Jesus, the light of the world came into the world, and the darkness could not overcome it. In the person of Jesus, it is goodness that infects the bad, not the other way around. As the salt of the earth, as the light of the world, that's what we're doing. We are infecting the darkness and the evil of the world with truth and love, just like light, just like salt. If you work a little salt into it, you can't help but taste it, even just a little bit. You put a light in the middle of a dark room, it's all you'll be able to see. I once read a statistic that said if the earth were completely flat and completely dark, you'd be able to see a candle from 3 miles away. That's the power that light has against darkness. By the power of God, we are these people. We're not trying to become them. God's already done that work among us. And others should notice this about us. Jesus says that it is by our good deeds that they will recognize us. In fact, he says that the good deeds we do should be unable to go unnoticed. That's how obvious and evident and strange they'll look. Here's what Dallas Willard says. Have you ever thought about trying to hide a city set on a hill? Can you imagine being assigned the job of hiding San Francisco? Jesus is saying that when you are tied into the kingdom of the heavens, there is going to be something so obviously different about you that people are going to think, what have you done? Isn't that a fun thought? If you're wondering how to be the salt, how to be the light, everything, again, comes down to how we interact with the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is saying we just have to take what we hear from our teacher, and we've got to actually do it. When we do that, we are in the process of becoming what we already are, the chosen people of God, the light of the world, the salt of the earth, the blessing to all other people. Now, there's one more thing that I want to say about salt and light. Again, you're welcome to disagree with me. I think salt and light are at their best when they don't overpower, when they're separate from the other stuff. Have you ever had that dish that was way too salty? That's all you could taste and it was awful? And accidentally swallowing seawater is nobody's idea of a good time, I would say. But a sprinkle of salt that brings food to life, that highlights and accents flavor. I mean, that's something pretty special. And think about light too. We all know what it's like to suffer under those really harsh fluorescent lights. We know what it's like to be blinded by the sun reflecting off of windows or bright concrete in a way that hurts our eyes. But we also know the breath of hope that comes from being in a completely dark room and finally seeing a spark, a match, a candle. We know the help that a lamp in a dark room can bring to how that makes us feel. Turn something ominous and foreboding into something inviting. We know the sigh of relief that comes from light appearing at the end of the metaphorical tunnel. Light and salt work pretty well when they're not the majority. Jesus seems to be preparing us for the reality that maybe we're going to be working at the margins. Maybe we will constantly face opposition, that we will always have trouble, that we shouldn't ever expect to slowly and methodically conquer the world like an empire. Because I believe that we are meant in some way to live life as the people of God on the margins. We are supposed to be a minority. We're supposed to be speaking truth to power. We're not meant to be power. And that is, I think, where Sunset Ridge finds itself today. We were once a church of 700 or 800. There was a time where we felt so big and vibrant and successful that we thought nothing could stop us. And here we find ourselves, a little shy of 700 this morning. I confess to you that I've had a hard time facing this reality. I've had a hard time thinking about our brothers and sisters who decided that they no longer wanted to be a part of this community, even in the short time that we've been here. I've had a hard time wondering what God is up to here when our numbers fall. But I think that Jesus is speaking to us. Because as I look around, I think it has never been easier for the people of Sunset Ridge to be light than it is right now. Because light shines in darkness. The kingdom thrives on the margins. And because God, if you haven't noticed, absolutely loves to do big miracles with small numbers. And our numbers just aren't the point. They never were, truly. Jesus is asking us here to evaluate ourselves in ways that numbers just can't quite capture. How have you been shaped by the Spirit? Jesus seems to ask. How do you look more like Jesus today than you did 5 years ago? How much have you grown in love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control? How much do you allow the light and the blessing and the love of God to flow through you? How much do you allow it to flow from you? That's not something that you can really capture on an Excel spreadsheet. That's not something that you can chart over time. But I think it's what we're after. I think it's what God intends for us. And I have some news for you. I may just be preaching to myself here. But God may grow us into an enormous church, and he may not. But if we trust in the blessing that he's spoken over us, if we commit to living our lives from the reality of being the people of God, if we put the words of Jesus into practice, our light will shine. If we use our gifts, our resources, our hearts for the good of others, the light of Sunset Ridge will never be dimmed. If we live in a way that allows God to mold us, to transform us, to work through us, we cannot be extinguished. If you look closely on the margins, you will find that they are absolutely covered with the fingerprints of the God that we worship. It is where he likes to dwell. It is where he likes to work. And it is where he likes to bring a miracle. So I think it might be for our benefit if we got comfortable being on the margins and we got to work alongside him. Things may never look like they used to, but also with God's help, things will look much brighter. So now the task for you, the individual, for us, the people of God, is to become what we already are. It's a tall order, but it's one that I believe we can do. We carry with us the good news of God. We carry with every breath that fills our lungs the hope, the promise, the joy of our Creator. It's good news that infects, that spreads, that brings light to the darkness. And when we are shaped by that reality, we become unrecognizable. We become completely different. We perform daring acts of goodness, radical acts of kindness, insane acts of love that baffle and mystify. This can be something big, like opening up your home, like selling all you have and giving it away, like preaching on a street corner, like being a missionary. But more and more, I'm convinced that light shines most brightly through small acts of human connection. I'm convinced that what people are hungriest for is for someone to look them in the eye, to know them, and to love them. You can be a person spreading goodness just by inviting someone to a meal. You can be a person reflecting the image of God by telling someone exactly how hard your week was, so that a real conversation can begin. And church, I believe we can be a church of light. I believe we can be those people. I believe that we can be a beacon of goodness in our neighborhood and in our city if we are the place that welcomes those who need welcoming. If we were the place that provided a space for drinking coffee, for walking the dog through the park, for hearing a story on the front lawn with the kids, and more importantly, for being in relationship, in community with people you never would have met otherwise. I do not believe that we need hundreds of people and a giant budget to leave a mark of goodness on our neighborhood. I don't believe we need to infiltrate city council. I don't believe that Christians need to rule from the throne because one already sits on the throne, the crucified Lord Jesus. We need the God who is already at work, who already rules and reigns, who, when we go out to the streets to bring Jesus, we are shocked to find he's already there. He's already working, already blessing his people. We need to follow his voice. We need to follow his teachings. We need to follow his example. And in doing this, we become the people that God created us to be. The question is for us, can we live light? Will you join me now as we stand and worship our God together? The hard work has already been done. God has called us to be a people of his light. God has transformed us into his children, into a holy nation through whom all people will be blessed. May we go out and live out of this reality. May we go and shine his light. May we go and be salt in the earth. May we always look to our Father in heaven for guidance. May we remember where he dwells on the margins. Go in peace.